The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And once again, we are very blessed to have the presence of Joseph P. Farrell. And as many of you already know, he is a brilliantly gifted researcher and prolific writer, author. He has a doctorate from the University of Oxford, and he has published 4 previous works on theology. He recently has moved back to his home state of South Dakota, where he pursues research on his other loves and hobbies, and those include classical music. He is an organist, plays the harpsichord, and Joseph P. Farrell is a real composer, not a cut, copy, paste guy. He is a real composer, and he composes classical music. He's deeply involved in physics, alternative history, and science, and what people inside the box would call strange stuff. True,
you did it again.
Yeah, I had to. That's just too rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't think it's strange, but
no, that's right.
Well, as I promised a listener, a lady emailed a couple of questions, and she wanted to know if Stonehenge could have been a bell-type weapon.
Well, the short answer is no. I don't see in that structure, or to be frank, any of the monolithic structures that you find in England, the Avebury Circle and Stillbury Hill and so on, I don't find in any of those structures the type of engineering and machine-like properties that I find in the Great Pyramid. So the short answer would be no. That being said, I read a few years ago, or maybe I even saw it on TV, I forget which. It's been several years, so my mind is kind of foggy. But there were some British researchers that had taken a bunch of magnetometers and other recording equipment to Stonehenge and recorded some very strange magnetic readings and some very strange acoustic readings of all things, believe it or not. So maybe there is a machine-like property that we're unaware of, but I just don't as yet think that the case is really established enough for us to go that far. So no, it's not anything like a bell device. Now, there's one more thing I should mention about Stonehenge. The famous English astronomer Lockyer actually, many years ago, published a very controversial paper in which he analyzed Stonehenge from the standpoint of its astronomical alignments, and he concluded that it was an extremely sophisticated kind of analog observatory, if you will, of various celestial alignments. So there is in Stonehenge an encoded or an embodied science that's quite sophisticated. And again, we have these megalithic structures all over the world, in Mexico and certainly in England, and of course in Iraq and other places, where we very clearly see at least a sophisticated astronomy, and that of course means it's a sophisticated science. So we really don't have any, I think, good explanation for these things, other than I should mention that many people are probably aware of the fact that some of these ancient cultures, particularly in Mesoamerica and Mexico, have very peculiarly Egyptian elements in their mythologies, and people have often commented on that and wondered what is going on. Well, my take on it would be this: in the Giza Death Star series, I take the position that the Great Pyramid and then the second pyramid there of Sephron, the second big pyramid, that incidentally, the second pyramid is the one that many people mistake for the Great Pyramid because it looks taller. It's actually a little bit smaller. It's just the way it kind of sits on the plateau makes it look bigger. But I take the position that at least those two structures, plus the Sphinx, predate dynastic Egypt by at least 4,000 to 6,000 years. So whatever society built those things, the Egyptians later came along and sort of claimed them, so to speak. And then we see Egypt as kind of the second layer, the legacy of that very, very ancient advanced civilization. And I think that Egypt, in the process of claiming that legacy, probably had claim or knew about the ability to navigate the globe. And I think that there are enough indicators that would suggest that Egypt may have extended her influence quite literally across the oceans. And that may account for why we see a third layer, yet another declined legacy in some of these Mesoamerican and Mexican structures that embody this very sophisticated astronomical science. So that's kind of a long answer, but it kind of fleshes things out, I hope, a bit for your listener.
Well, thank you for that, Joseph. Could Stonehenge have been sort of an astronomical device?
Well, again, it is a device in the sense it's very clearly intended as some sort of an observatory.
Right.
But, the presence of these very strange readings that some British researchers have come up with there may suggest that there's another possible purpose to the structure. But as yet, I don't think that we've got to the point where, on the basis of modern scientific theory and the data that we have available from those readings, that we can really begin to reconstruct what that other purpose might possibly have been. So I'm a little reluctant to go much further than that.
Okay. This listener also wanted to know if you were familiar with Michael Heiser's work.
Well, that's a name that I have heard, but to be quite honest with you, I'm not able to comment because I really haven't read any of his things. If it's the person I'm thinking of about, he wrote a book several years ago about the Christian doctrine of creation, but I'm not certain it's the same person, so I really can't comment on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, there you go, listener. Joseph has answered your questions.
Attempted to.
That's fair. Okay. Joseph, we were talking in the last one about, we were going to bring up red mercury.
Oh, boy.
What is that? What's it used for?
Well, it's an interesting story, and it's kind of a long-winded answer, so please bear with me here. In the bell, the documentation that was uncovered as the Iron Curtain collapsed indicated that the bell's fuel, so to speak, was codenamed Serum 525. And in that documentation, this serum is described as being a very heavy kind of gooey liquid. Think of hair jelly. It had apparently that type of consistency, although it was extremely heavy. And it was also described as having kind of a violet reddish hue. Now that got me to thinking that it may have possibly been some isotope of mercury, which of course is a very heavy liquid metal, and probably an isotope form of mercury. In other words, a slightly different chemical and nuclear structure. So that got me to thinking, well, maybe the Nazis had doped that mercury with some other substances that were radioactive in nature, such as thorium or barium or even a strange substance with unusual magnetic properties like bismuth, which incidentally looks kind of pale pink. So, as I was doing this, I recalled the nuclear weapons scare of the 1990s was precisely this substance called red mercury. And for those listeners who don't know the story of this, back in the 1990s, it was rumored that the Russians had, during the Soviet era, discovered an explosive. It's in the technical literature called the Ballo technique, which means that the explosive has an unusually high level of brisance. In other words, the explosive pressure that's generated in the pressure wave of the explosion. And in fact, according to the red mercury legend, this brisance was so high, it was so powerful, that it could be used as an initiator in a hydrogen bomb. Now, the reason that that's important, folks, is that in a normal hydrogen bomb, it takes an atomic bomb as the trigger, quite literally, to set off a hydrogen bomb. But if you can construct a hydrogen bomb, if you can initiate a fusion reaction by purely chemical means, then you can in effect make a hydrogen bomb, so to speak, very clean. You'll get an initial heavy radioactive pulse and so on from the hydrogen bomb, but you won't have all of that nasty, lingering radioactive residue and fallout that you have as a result of an A bomb. So, this was the nuclear nightmare par excellence, because this stuff, if true, made thermonuclear weapons, which again are far more powerful than mere atom bombs. It made thermonuclear weapons, usable, to put it bluntly. And the other thing is that, of course, in its own right, this red mercury would have been a very powerful explosive. Again, according to the legend, it had the explosive power that something the size of a hand grenade made out of this stuff could have blown a very large ocean liner out of the sea.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was rumored to be extraordinarily powerful. Now, the interesting thing about this red mercury, and this will probably really put your listeners into a tailspin, it had to be confected inside of a nuclear reactor. In other words, in order for it to obtain its special explosive properties, the substance had to be immersed in the center of a reactor coil, and then of course by neutron bombardment, it acquired these extra properties. Now here's the tailspin. The substance was purportedly confected and actually researched at the Soviet nuclear military research facilities near Sverdlovsk, which in Russia is the same city. It used to be called Ekaterinenburg, where the Tsar's family was murdered. And incidentally, it's the same place that Francis Gary Powers was in his mission that he was shot down in the Soviet Union in the U-2 flight. That was the very place that his mission targeted to be photographed. So in other words, it's all this very peculiar stuff going on. But the interesting part of the story to me was, of course, that this red mercury, which the Russians purportedly discovered, actually sounded extraordinarily like the substance serum-525 that the Nazis were purportedly using and researching in the bell.
Now, the bell.
Yeah.
The bell. Okay. The SS Brotherhood, the bell. What is the bell? And are there generations of it today?
Oh boy, good question. For the listeners who don't know the bell was Nazi Germany. This is a story, incidentally, I should put into a bit of a context. It only emerged as a story after German reunification. As a result of that, many of the underground installations that were in the former eastern zone of Germany, and then also inside of Poland, modern-day Poland, in a province called Silesia, which used to be a part of Germany. If you want to know where Silesia was, just look on a pre-World War II map of Germany, and Silesia is that little finger of Germany that sticks down between Poland and Czechoslovakia. It's in modern-day Poland now, but it became a part of Germany during the Polish partitions with Austria-Hungary and Russia under Frederick the Great. But the bell was housed in some of these underground, very secret installations in Silesia. And, of course, after German reunification and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, two things happened. The first is that German reunification kicked loose a spate of declassification by the United States and the United Kingdom. So a lot of documents that had been kept top secret for quite literally almost 40 years were all of a sudden declassified. It was as if that event made the whole point of keeping them declassified very moot, because some story was going to get out, and it was a big story, and it's the bell, and also, I believe, a very successful German atomic bomb project. But as a result of reunification, these installations and these documents became available, and that's how the story of the bell became public. A Polish researcher by the name of Igor Witkowski was the one that uncovered it. As a result of his researches, we know that the bell was probably a device that the Nazis were researching for the purposes of controlling space-time, of being able to manipulate it. And that, in turn, means that they were researching a physics and a technology that was very flexible. It would have allowed them to come up with an entirely new system or means of propulsion. It would have allowed them to come up with essentially a limitless energy supply. And, of course, it would have allowed them to make a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a kitchen match. So, put everything I said previously about red mercury into this context. The potential power of the physics that they were researching with this device had truly planet-busting potential. Now, one more thing about the bell is that it was given its own unique classification in all of Nazi Germany's secret weapons projects. It was classed higher than their atomic bomb research, their fuel air bomb research, and every other secret weapons project underway in the Third Reich. It was classified as war decisive. Now, your other question, the really good part of the question is what you asked, are there other generations of this thing?
Yeah, I worry a lot about this.
Yes, well, you're right. You're right to worry, because here's the rub. In 1945, the SS, as the Nazi leadership realized that the war was lost, the SS murdered approximately 60 of the scientists and technicians that were working on this project.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yes. And this, incidentally, is the very reason why we know about the project at all, because the SS general that was tasked with the murders of those scientists was subsequently tried in a Polish war crimes court after the war and sentenced to execution. So, we have the extreme oddity of Poland trying a Nazi war criminal for crimes that occurred on German soil during the war and against Germans. So, as a result of this SS general's trial affidavit became top secret classified within the Polish archives. And this is one of those documents that, as the Iron Curtain fell, came to light. Now, I should stress another point here. The bell was tested apparently at night under some very extraordinarily unusual circumstances toward the end of the war. And Polish war criminals that were, or not Polish war criminals, Polish concentration camp inmates that were used as kind of the ordinary day-to-day labor in this project, saw what they described as barrel-like looking things glowing a pale blue light and then floating above the tree lines in Silesia and then falling, floating back down below them again. So in other words, the bell is probably the real basis behind the persistent rumors that have been present since the end of World War II that the Nazis came up with some sort of flying saucer technology. What happened to it is this: we don't know.
That's scary. Yeah,
it is, because after the murder of these scientists, the SS general who headed all of Nazi Germany's, and my friends, I mean all of them, quite literally every last scrap of them, was a four-star SS general or Obergruppenführer by the name of Dr. Hans Kammler. Kammler dies no less than 3 times under different circumstances. So in other words, his death really isn't a matter that can be credibly taken. Kammler, the Bell, and all of the Bell's project documentation, along with a huge German aircraft called the Junkers 390, which is a 6-engine, ultra-long-range, ultra-heavy-lift aircraft. It would have been capable of flying nonstop from Nazi Germany to Argentina. That's the range that this craft had. It was just gigantic. The last known Junkers 390, and I have a picture of this in SS Brotherhood of the Bell. A picture of one was taken in Prague precisely in April of 1945, being loaded for some long trip. So it's likely, Igor Vitkovsky and Nick Cook and I, the authors that have researched the Bell, we think one of 2 things happened to it. It either disappeared along with General Kammler and its project documentation into some very secret, very deep black research projects in the United States, or what's more disturbing is that it made its way into an independent post-war Nazi project that was being conducted in Argentina. And that's the real problem, because interestingly enough, another British researcher by the name of Geoffrey Brooks was able to track down some declassified Argentine intelligence documents in Buenos Aires. And these indicate that the Bell, in fact, was flown into Argentina. So somebody, either way we slice the pie, somebody after the war got a hold of this technology and continued to research it. Now, there's one more thing. Do I have your indulgence?
Oh, you bet you do.
Well, I didn't think I'd get an argument, but I wanted to check and make sure.
Oh, gosh. You don't
Well, that's the nice thing about this show. We don't have to worry about breaks. I really like this format, so
Well, this is the best bedtime story. I'll tell you, these are... you don't sleep very well when you listen to this. Oh, my God.
That's true. That's right.
It's a real eye-opener.
Well, the interesting thing about all this is that for your listeners who are interested in the subject of UFOs...
Oh, yes.
The Bell, let's just rehearse a few things about it. The Bell was obviously bell-shaped. It looked like a bell. It had a kind of a ceramic metallic covering. It was cryogenically cooled. And now here's some very important data points. Listen carefully, listeners. The Bell was about 12 to 15 feet wide and stood about 15 to 18 feet tall. It made a kind of a buzzing, hissing, cracking sound when it was in operation. The Germans actually nicknamed it Die Bienenstock, or the beehive, because of the sound it made. When it was tested underground, it was housed in a room that was lined with ceramic brick, which is an interesting indicator because that means that it gave off very powerful radiation. Now, on December 9th, 1965, one of ufology's most famous crash and retrieval events occurred near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. It's called the Kecksburg Acorn. And if you read the research of Stan Gordon, the ufologist that's really investigated this quite thoroughly over the years, you will discover that the eyewitnesses who actually saw the device that crashed at Kecksburg describe a device that was approximately 12 to 15 feet wide, approximately 15 to 18 feet tall. It had an acorn shape. In other words, it had a shape very similar to this Nazi bell. It buzzed and hissed and popped and cracked, when it was resting on the ground.
Yeah.
Then, according to the story, it was loaded on to flatbed trucks by the U.S. military, which arrived really quickly.
Very quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah, like they were expecting it.
Like they were expecting it.
Yeah.
About 2 hours after this thing crashed. They carted it off to Wright-Patterson Air Base, where a local construction worker in a construction firm was sitting at his desk when all of a sudden he got a call from Wright-Patterson for an order of, now hang on, for 4,000 ceramic bricks. So he takes these bricks up to Wright-Patterson. He goes into this hangar, and behind a kind of a silk screen hanging curtain, he sees this bell-like shaped object standing on struts. And that's the story. In other words, one of ufology's most famous crash and retrieval cases connects with the Nazi bell on any number of data points that I think can hardly be coincidental.
And they tried to pass that off as swamp gas.
They tried to pass it off as swamp gas. They've tried to pass it off as a meteor, and they've tried to pass it off as a Soviet satellite, which coincidentally was decaying from its orbit and re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and falling to the Earth at approximately the same time. Now, here's the rub with both stories. If you look at the map that Stan Gordon and Michael Hazeman have put in their publications of the course of the Kecksburg Acorn that it took in flight prior to the crash, and I reproduce this in this map in my book Reich of the Black Sun, the course of the bell comes down, or the Kecksburg Acorn, comes down from somewhere in the Canadian Northwest, over the Great Lakes in Michigan, and then into Ohio, where it stops, according to the witnesses who see it. It stops momentarily, sort of hovers there for a couple of seconds, and then changes course, darts off to southwestern Pennsylvania, where it crashes. Yeah, and even prior to the crash, it executes a nice, perfect S-turn. Now, my friends, meteors don't stop, hover, change course, and then crash after executing an S-turn.
You're right.
Yeah, they just don't do this. And incidentally, folks, neither do Soviet satellites.
That's right.
And, that aspect of the story has always intrigued me, because if it's coming down from Canada, one of the persistent sort of Nazi legends that began to surface after the war was that the Nazis had not only bases in South America and Antarctica and so on, but also bases up in the Canadian Arctic, in various little places that they'd established off of Hudson's Bay. And again, we can reasonably assume that might be possible, because the Nazis did set up automatic weather stations all over that part of Canada. They would bring in U-boats and drop this equipment off to make weather reports back to Berlin so that, they could predict the weather fronts and so on that were moving across the Atlantic and into Europe.
Yeah, weather,
Well, no, they did do these things. This is a matter of documentation. But my point is if they did these things, in the wilds and almost barely populated areas of that part of Canada, then they could possibly, very well have set up a base. Now, the reason I mention all this is that, again, whatever happened up there with whatever this device in Kecksburg that crashed was, it looks as if one of two things happened. Either the U.S. military was testing something up there and it got away from them, crashed in Pennsylvania, and they went into a near panic and then decided, okay, we've got to find out where this is, and they go in and they pick it up about 2 hours after it crashes by calling a local radio station to get directions. And that's literally what happened.
That is hysterical. Wow.
But the other thing that may have happened is that the Nazis may have been testing this thing up there. And it got away from them. We knew that there was some project like this going on in Nazi Germany, and when this thing crashes, we knew that that's probably what it was, and went in and we caught it. And actually, of the two versions, the second is my favorite, or favored version, because of research that's going to be published in this new book of mine that I can't get into right now, but I'm still checking a couple things out. But that's my favorite explanation. I think that the Kecksburg Acorn is probably some technological derivative of the original bell, if it's not the original bell itself, that it was continued under Nazi auspices after the war, that they were testing this thing, it got away from them, and we picked it up. So, that's kind of a long way around Harvey's barn, but, I think it's a fascinating thing because it means that this technology survived the war, and that somebody is developing it, and they're not talking. And the interesting thing to me about the whole Kecksburg incident is the day after Kecksburg, after all of this military and NASA activity, I mean, friends, the military literally placed this little Pennsylvania village under martial law for about a day. And the day after this occurs, interestingly enough, the NASA director, I believe his name was James Webb at the time, I'm not certain of this, the governor of Pennsylvania, are both at President Lyndon Johnson's ranch in Texas. And we're told that what they were discussing was the Vietnam War. Now, I can buy Lyndon Johnson discussing the Vietnam War with a governor, but it just so happened to be the governor of Pennsylvania. But I don't buy Lyndon Johnson discussing the Vietnam War with the head of NASA.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. I mean, Joseph, that's our stretch.
Yeah, that's a real stretch.
Who visits who,
Yeah, right.
And when. Very important to keep track of those things.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Well, we're told the Roswell incident, people came out at first and, I saw this and this and this, and then I'm not sure I saw this, but I think I did.
Right.
And wasn't there's some kind of law that if something like that comes down on your property, you can be snatched by the government and held incommunicado? I mean, first it's a weather balloon. I mean, a UFO. Then it's a weather balloon. And it gets down to, just like the incident that you just spoke about, are you going to believe what you saw, or are you going to believe what I tell you you saw?
Right.
And there's just such a dazzling, confused mixture of stories out there.
Well, it's interesting that you mention Roswell and all these stories because, as you know, I have a rather different take.
Yes.
I thought that's what you were getting at.
Yes.
Well, you're right. We have at least 4 different official government explanations. The first explanation that came out was, of course, the famous Roswell story itself that appeared in the Roswell Daily Record. That was a story that was communicated to that newspaper by the base press agent there, Walter Haut, I believe was his name, and done so on orders of the base commander, Colonel Blanchard. And it's interestingly enough, my friends, Colonel Blanchard, after the Roswell incident, subsequently became a 4-star United States Air Force general. So this man is, this man is not somebody to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
But Colonel Blanchard was the one that pretty much everybody has agreed was the one that told Walter Haut to put out this story. So the first Air Force explanation is, hey, a saucer crashed, we got it.
Yeah.
Then almost immediately, you can sense the panic button was thrown big time in Washington, D.C., because all of this wreckage was ordered to be picked up, flown in a B-29 over to Fort Worth, Texas, where Jesse Marcel, who was the base intelligence officer, and most people are familiar with the story, he goes over there and he's more or less forced to have his picture taken along with wreckage of a weather balloon and radar reflecting foil. Okay. Then the third, that's the second explanation. Well, it was just a crashed weather balloon. So, we had all of this ado about nothing.
Yeah.
Then the third explanation that the Air Force came out with a few years back, and it's one that kind of fell off the radar screen, was that the Japanese, toward the end of the war, in their desperation, were thinking about flying little balloon bombs across the jet stream of the Pacific and having them detonate over the United States. And actually they did some of this, and there were actually a couple of people killed by one of these balloon bombs in Oregon.
Balloon bombs.
Balloon bombs. Japanese balloon bombs.
Oh, gosh.
And again, I just, my mind boggles that the military would be going to all of this effort just for a couple of Japanese balloon bombs.
Yeah.
Then finally we got the last official, this is now the fourth story that the government has told us. It's worse than the Kennedy assassination, my friends. The fourth story that they told us is that, okay, it was the Project Mogul balloons that we were sending up into the atmosphere with various recording devices to monitor the progress of Soviet atomic bomb research. And, it was a very top secret hush-hush project at the time. And therefore the military's reaction, is at least explainable on that basis. But again, none of this really fits the stories that have come out.
Right.
All right. This brings us to an event that happened in the late 1990s when more Magic 12 documents showed up at the home of Timothy Cooper, who then shared them with Stanton Friedman, who in turn passed them along to Drs. Robert and Ryan Wood, who have a website where they've posted all these documents and their analysis of some of them. This last set of Magic 12 documents is far more extensive in terms of its sheer volume than the original batch that was released much earlier to Jamie Shandera and that most people think about as the Magic 12 documents. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about this second set. Now, in these documents, to me, and I remember the first time that I listened to Coast AM, Whitley Strieber was actually the one that was talking about these with Art Bell, and I just listened with rapt attention as he was reading portions of these documents. I thought, gee whiz, I've got to get these. So I wrote off to Dr. Ryan Wood and ordered his book version of them. And I sat down and I started reading them. Now, my friends, I want to tell you what I found, and you can read about my examination of them in Reich of the Black Sun, and then again in SS Brotherhood of the Bell. I examined two different sets of documents in those two books. The most interesting thing, GeorgeAnn, that I stumbled into was, and I want your listeners to understand what my argument is here, the kind of argument I'm making. I am not arguing for or against the authenticity or provenance of these documents. Okay? My concern is not whether they're authentic or not at all. I could care less. I am concerned with examining the internal evidence of the documents themselves. What do they say, and is it plausible? Now, what they say is very interesting. They say, first of all, that something with exotic technology crashed. Secondly, that the Americans who examined this wreckage were kind of baffled by what they saw. So what did they do? They brought in the local Nazi paperclip rocket scientists to look at this stuff. That's what the documents say. So you can imagine Von Braun and Arthur Rudolph and Hermann Oberth and so on, all these Germans sweltering in the New Mexico heat, because they're not used to it, obviously, going out into the middle of the desert and looking at this stuff. Okay, that's the second thing the documents say. The third thing the documents say is that these rocket scientists take a look at this stuff and say, oh no, we've never seen anything like this before, but it looks to us like it's got some sort of neutron power engine running on fusion and so on, and charge differentials and stuff like this. And when I read that, GeorgeAnn, I just had to stop. And I said, say what? We have rocket scientists going out, taking a look at this stuff, and this is what pops out of their head?
Fascinating.
Fascinating. Yeah. Now, the other part of the thing that really caught me in the documents was that every time there was any discussion of the recovered bodies, all of that was blacked out.
Yes.
So, in other words, on the basis of extant evidence in the documents themselves, we know nothing about any evidence that it was extraterrestrial. But the documents are full of detailed descriptions of what the technology was. And here's the long and short of it, friends. If you look at what the documents say comprises the technology, it's certainly exotic, but it is not exotic enough to be extraterrestrial. It is, however, exotic enough that if you trace all the little details of these wartime Nazi secret weapons projects, you will discover some amazing parallels between what's described in those Magic 12 documents and what's described in those Nazi secret weapons. Case in point, everybody is familiar with Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell.
Right.
The thesis of his book is that this was an ET craft, and he was put in charge of seeding into American industry all of this exotic alien technology. And one of the things that he mentions as being a direct result of this alien technology was the transistor. Now, he's correct in that the transistor does not seem to have a very good pre-discovery history. But as I point out in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, we do not need ET to explain this sudden eruption of transistor and semiconductor technology into American industry, because
I agree with you.
I reproduce a photo in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell of a little German Klystron tube, a vacuum tube, which is about as big as the last knuckle on your pinky finger. The Germans introduced this tube into production in the year 1940. Now, my friends, the sad truth is that the Allied equivalent of that vacuum tube at the end of World War II was 10 times bigger. So the Germans were miniaturizing electronic components about 5 to 10 years ahead of the Western Allies. Wow. Now, the other interesting thing is you can only begin doing that if you've made some sort of good progress in semiconductor research. And guess what? The Germans did. So if we're looking for a real explanation as to the sudden rise of semiconductor technology within 2 years of the end of World War II in this country, the best explanation is it's not extraterrestrial, it's Nazi.
Joseph, I agree with you right there. I think that for the sake of another agenda, they have tried to get people to believe in ET.
Well, this was the point. Yeah, this was the point I was getting to, because in these Magic 12 documents, the extant evidence points to something exotic, though terrestrial. Now, let's stop and think it through, friends. If the United States military recovered something exotic that crashed at Roswell, and I believe they did, is the United States likely to share that technology, to even show it to a bunch of captured Nazi rocket scientists if it has the slightest idea or thinking in mind that this is an extraterrestrial craft? And my answer is no. The United States military probably would not have done any such ludicrous thing.
You're right.
Because that would have been a complete breach of security. There's no need for the Nazis to know. If, on the other hand, however, that thing that crashed at Roswell looked like the other Nazi secret weapons that we were familiar with, although it had all this bizarre and strange and a very advanced technology in it, then will the United States military call in the German paperclip scientists to have them take a look? You betcha. Now, here's the other thing. This is an argument, if we look at this internal evidence very carefully, would tell us one thing about those Magic 12 documents themselves. If they are intentional disinformation, then they are disinformation based on some degree of truth, because who, in their right mind, if they're hoaxing documents of this nature to prove the existence of ET, is going to include in it information that very clearly indicates time and again the involvement of the German Nazi paperclip scientists in the affair. Yeah. In other words, that's got to be coming from inside knowledge. And incidentally, that corroborates Lieutenant Colonel Corso, because he himself mentions in his book that the paperclip scientists were somehow involved with that Roswell episode.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, very big wow.
Wow. And, well, there's one more thing. There's one more wow to come.
Go ahead.
Sure. Friends, do you think the United States military would have hit the panic button if something Nazi had crashed in the New Mexico desert?
Of course not.
Oh, yes, they would.
You think so?
Oh, absolutely. Because what does it mean, GeorgeAnn?
We're vulnerable.
If something Nazi crashes in the New Mexico desert in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, where on earth is it coming from?
Yeah.
That means that somebody out there, Nazis out there, are still developing this stuff. The war isn't over, and they can enter our airspace with impunity.
Maybe with cloaking, when we talk about radar,
Oh yes, there are stealth properties that occur naturally as a result of some of this physics. So again, my point is that you bet the American military is going to be sent into a tailspin of panic if what crashed in Roswell was Nazi. And this is where I think ET enters the picture then, because it becomes the final deep cover layer of disinformation, of misdirection.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
Well, Joseph, they've got, okay, let's bring this aspect into it when we're talking about this kind of technology, because I think it is technology.
Oh, yes, I do too.
When we talk about UFOs and just thousands and thousands and thousands of people that claim very real experiences
Sure.
with little aliens and being abducted.
Right.
I think these things can be framed with technology. There was some writings that came out several years ago on, it's called The Matrix, and it was by, I think John Grace is his real name, that put it out. Valerian was his internet web name. There is so much information in these books about that kind of thing. The technologies, the the fact that they took people and experimented on them, and how to separate their personalities, how to have things happen to them physically, marks and stuff like that, without even touching them. See, and we call that demonic, but they know how to do this on a technological scale.
Well, here's another aspect of the story, and I mention this only as an epigraph in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, just to kind of stimulate people's thinking in a different direction other than E.T. all the time. Most people are probably familiar with the case of Betty and Barney Hill, the famous abductees from the early 60s, black man and white woman that were allegedly abducted. And, a book was written called The Interrupted Journey about their experience. It's kind of a classic in abduction literature. But in it, if you read one passage in it, Barney Hill, under hypnosis by his psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, was asked the question, what do they look like?
Yeah.
And here comes his response. They look like Nazis.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the surprise of the psychiatrist when he hears that. So you hear him ask then, well, can you describe, are they wearing uniforms or something? And Barney Hill then goes on to say that they're wearing black with red or black scarves or something. I don't know, I don't recall right offhand the reference. But in other words, right in the middle of this supposedly extraterrestrial abduction, and let's be honest, there is an extraterrestrial aspect to it because, of course, Betty Hill's famous star map that Marjorie Fish was later able to reconstruct from the descriptions and diagrams that Betty Hill drew her is an exact analog of astronomical alignments. So, in other words, there is that aspect to this that really is not explainable. But sitting squat in the middle of it is Barney Hill's reference to Nazis.
Yeah. Fascinating. Oh, my gosh.
Oh, yes.
Well, we know that, it's interesting that so much of this type of highly advanced technology has come out of the German mind.
Yes.
And, when we talk about that and you trace it back,
right,
they're the children of Toph.
Tehuta.
Yeah, the children of Raphael. Researchers have traced that out, and it's fascinating.
Oh, yes.
They're not like us.
Well, it is an extremely interesting thing that within Norse mythology, that they maintain, the Old Norse myths maintain that they are an extraterrestrial race.
Yeah.
And, the Nazis bought into this big time.
Oh, sure.
But the other interesting thing in that respect, and I get into this in the Giza Death Star books and much more so in the Cosmic War, is that you find these myths of descent from some sort of white Caucasoid race, not only with the Norse and the Scandinavians and the Germans, but you find it with the Celts.
Oh, yes.
You find it with, oddly enough, the Japanese. You find it again with the Mayans with their god Quetzalcoatl, who is a tall giant, blonde-haired or red-haired, blue-eyed, white man, bearded. And he's also described in their legends as the feathered serpent. You find a similar legend with the Incas in Peru with Viracocha, who again is a tall, white, bearded, blonde or red-haired giant with blue eyes, who again is described as a feathered serpent.
Right.
And then you mentioned the Egyptian god Tahuta. The description of him in Egyptian legend is very interesting because he is associated with the salamander.
Fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With reptiles again.
Yes.
So again, you have yet another odd little kind of parallel. And, to bring it all back home to Germany, one of the most secret offshoots of the ancient German order of the Teutonic Knights was called the Society of Lizards.
Oh, my.
Oh, yeah. So, you get all of these little connections, and you start putting it all together, and there is definitely something going on way back then. There is definitely, under the Nazis, something going on in the German national psyche that I don't know how to describe it other than that something seems to have been stirred or awoken. And you add to this mix that so much of our modern physics, the theoretical bedrock for it, was laid precisely in Germany.
Yeah.
Then you're right. You do just have to wonder.
Yeah, I do a lot of that.
So do I. You're not alone.
Let's jump across the ocean now
Sure.
to the death squads.
All right, the South American death squads. All right.
Yes.
One of the things that I maintain, and it's really not a matter of me maintaining it alone. This has been a persistent theme of other researchers, and in particular a superb researcher by the name of Peter Levenda. He wrote a book called Unholy Alliance, the secret alliance between the Nazis and the occult a few years ago, and it's just an excellent book. But one of the things that occurred at the end of the war is that Martin Bormann came up with a very comprehensive strategic evacuation plan in which they moved as much of their financial and scientific resources into safe overseas havens as they could. And the avowed eventual goal was for a resurgence of a Fourth Reich. And of course, South America was the place. When the Nazis arrive in South America, there are three things that they do that is very important for people to realize. They first of all coalesce and organize their financial infrastructure in South America under one very centralized, very secretive center of coordination, which was probably, incidentally, conducted by Martin Bormann, whom I believe actually survived the war and lived out the rest of his days in South America. The other thing they do is they organize or coalesce their security operations in Latin America. So in other words, in all of those little colonies that you find in South America, you have the Nazis doing two things. They set up these colonies in very secure premises. Think only of the notorious Colonia Dignidad in Chile.
Oh, yeah.
Well known. I mean, this is a matter of record. It's not disputable. It's not debatable.
A lot of children disappeared.
A lot of children disappeared. It was heavily involved in occult activities.
Oh, yeah.
It was heavily involved in South American death squads.
Yes.
They trained the death squads for Pinochet's Chilean military intelligence, and they most likely helped IT&T and the CIA overthrow Salvador Allende in Chile in 1972 or 3, I forget the exact year. So, in other words, they are heavily involved in these activities. And the other thing that Colonia Dignidad was well known to be involved with was drug money running, weapons running. There was an airport at Colonia Dignidad. They had their own anti-aircraft gun. It's just wild. So, this is but the tip of the iceberg. Because not merely coincidental, my friends, that it is after World War II that those South American drug cartels and drug lords begin to get really organized, very well financed, and their private security forces are very well trained, as anyone knows.
Yes.
And who's doing it for them?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's the motivation for this Nazi involvement in the drug trade? Very simple. It's twofold. Number one, they are targeting the United States, their old enemy, with a kind of a psychological warfare designed to undermine and sap the morale of the country. But secondly, and more importantly, they're taking this drug money, laundering it through all of their other operations, Latin American casinos and so on and so forth, and using that money, in my opinion, to fund their ongoing research projects.
Well, the Vatican Bank makes that real easy down there in Panama.
Well, you know, not just the Vatican Bank, but so many other things.
Yes.
And this, you know, again, I point out in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell how all of this in turn is the really murky backdrop to the assassination of President Kennedy. The Nazi angle to that assassination is the most deeply disturbing aspect of it. Most researchers have known about it who've investigated for years, but no one really knows what to make of it, because I think the implications are really just too frightening to ponder.
Well, let's ponder them.
Okay. One of the things that I point out in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, or actually there's two significant things that I should refer to. The first is that Lee Harvey Oswald is well known by most people to have had in his address book the name and telephone number of the local FBI field office agent in Dallas, Texas. His name is James Hosty. The other address in his address book was the address of General Edward Walker, who was a notorious right-wing general in this country at the time, whom after the assassination Oswald was accused of having attempted to assassinate. But the third address in his address book that no one wants to talk about, and in fact most people don't even know this. It was uncovered by Mae Brussel, believe it or not, the old redoubtable lady that began her radio show career and talked about political conspiracies, precisely because when she ordered the Warren Commission report, all 26 volumes, she discovered it had no index, so she dutifully sat down and wrote an index for it, and in the process discovered all of the holes in the report. Well, in Oswald's address book, there is the address of George Lincoln Rockwell. Now, many of your listeners may not be old enough to remember that name. I am. In fact, I remember seeing this man on television as a little boy. George Lincoln Rockwell was the president of the American Nazi Party. Now, what is Oswald doing with that address in his notebook? And another little interesting tidbit of information. One of Oswald's Marine buddies was actually deposed by the Warren Commission. And in his deposition, he says that he not only heard Oswald speaking Russian, but he heard him talking a language that he thought was German. So in other words, when Oswald's being trained by the CIA there at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, the same base, incidentally, that Gary Powers' U-2 flight flew out of, you know,
the coincidences.
The coincidences, you know, what are the actuary, you know, could we get an insurance company to draw up actuarial tables for us and lay money out for us on the basis that all of this is coincidence? I bet you there's not an insurance company that would take that bet.
No, I don't think so.
Okay?
Yeah.
So Oswald, when he's being trained at Atsugi Air Force Base by the CIA, is most likely being really trained by the West German Bundesnachrichtendienst, because you'll recall that nasty little deal that we made with Alan Dulles at the end of World War II with German military intelligence and Reinhard Gehlen. Dulles literally took over lock, stock, and Nazi. The entire German military intelligence outfit in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So that by the time that the CIA becomes law with President Truman's 1947 National Security Act, for all intents and purposes, the entire Soviet operational and analytical desk of the CIA is nothing but a front for a bunch of Nazis. So when President Kennedy comes along and says, I'm going to smash the CIA into 1 million pieces, whose power base is threatened? And incidentally, when he fires, who's the director of the CIA at the time of the Bay of Pigs? Why, it's Alan Dulles, who becomes a subsequent member of the Warren Commission. Why, Alan Dulles, who is also with him on the Warren Commission, a fellow by the name of John J. McCloy. Who's John J. McCloy? Well, he was the American High Commissioner for post-war American-occupied Germany. But prior to the war, he is the American attorney for I.G. Farben.
Aha, yes.
And he is so highly placed, guess who he shares a box with during the 1936 Berlin Olympics? None other than Adolf Hitler. So when McCloy is busy pardoning all these Nazis, 70,000 of them, folks, at the end of the war, many of them these paperclip scientists, it's no accident he ends up on the Warren Commission. Who else is on the Warren Commission as an investigator? Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso. Oh, my.
Oh, my, my.
Oh, my, my, my.
Yeah.
Now, one final little tidbit. When the House Committee on Assassinations, and then later the Joint Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s decided that they were going to tear into the Kennedy assassination, the two Kennedy assassinations, in fact, and the assassination of Dr. King, they allowed every subject to be investigated, except one subject would never be permitted to be investigated. Guess what it was? The Nazi connections to the assassination of President Kennedy.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they had plenty to hide.
Oh, they have plenty to hide. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
isn't it interesting, too, how the system is set up? Something really bad happens, and they put they call a panel.
Yes.
To review it. And everybody on that panel, I mean, it's fraud.
It's total fraud. Yes. Total.
Exactly.
It's, even as a kid, I was, I think, about 7.5 years old when the Warren Commission came out, and I remember, all the papers in the country excerpted portions of it.
Yeah.
And I remember in the Sioux Falls Argus-Leader, the city newspaper there, we had the Warren Commission's, cartoon drawing of the magic bullet and how it entered President Kennedy and then did all of its somersaulting gymnastics and then hit Governor Connolly 4 or 5 times. And then emerged pristine to be found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital in Dallas.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And I remember looking at that and thinking to myself, bullets just don't do this. This is just absolutely wrong. And of course, my family didn't believe it, when they read it in the newspaper. In fact, my dad said something I can't even repeat on the radio. So it's you're right. They just whitewashed this thing in the worst way. And then when they attempted to supposedly dig back into it in the 70s, they came out with another whitewash. At least they admitted the possibility of a conspiracy, but again, it's all misdirection. We don't know where the culprits are. But here's here's the real point of all of these meanderings and all these little details. I am not discounting all of the other plausibly argued versions of that conspiracy.
Right.
I do believe the FBI was involved. I do believe the CIA was involved. I do believe the mafia was involved. I do believe that probably our wonderful, patriotic American international bankers were involved. Okay?
Yeah.
But now here's the thing, friends. What one group has connections to all of those entities after the war, and what one group has the most to lose if any of President Kennedy's agendas go through? Cooperation with the Soviets in the space race, smashing the CIA, and so on and so forth. The one group that is most clearly affected by his policies, if they are allowed to be successful, the one group that stands the most to lose, besides the international bankers in their power base, are these post-war Nazis.
Well, you know, it's interesting, too, Joseph, and I know a lot of the listeners know this.
Mm-hmm.
It's just strange that a lot of the big politicians went to Yale, and they were a member of the Nazi Death Head, which is the Skull and
Bones. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, yeah, it's a network.
Oh, well, you know, it's a complete farce, you know, and I think this is the reason that most people in this country are, at present, so absolutely cynical with the whole political process.
Sure. Because,
you know, if we go back to the Reagan administration, after his assassination, who's really in charge? Well, Vice President Bush.
Yeah.
Then we have President Bush. Then we have his friend, Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
And now we've got his son. And now we're getting ready to have Hillary again. This dynasty has gone on long enough.
Amen to that.
No one really was fooled by the 2004 election, when we had Skull and Bones Oil Man A versus Skull and Bones Oil Man B.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You know, and we look at our voting. Real, you know, crackerjack programmers and hackers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
sure.
All they have to do is just do it, and they can change a lot of votes.
Well, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that. Back in the 80s, late 80s, a book came out called Vote Scam.
Oh, yeah.
By Ken and Kevin Collier, I believe was the author's names. Don't cite me on that. My memory is rather sketchy. But one of the things they pointed out, you know, almost a decade before that near-constitutional meltdown that we had in 2000 with the hanging chads in Florida.
Oh, yeah.
A decade before, they were pointing out serious discrepancies in voting results and reporting in Florida and on national elections as a result of computerized voting.
Yeah.
And they even cite and I wish I had my copy of this with me, because they cite then-Governor John Sununu of New Hampshire, who had his hands deeply into these electronic voting machines.
Yes.
Who later became President Bush's, I think, either press secretary or President Bush I, his press secretary or national security advisor or some such thing. He just comes right out and blatantly says that, you know, if the results aren't the way we want to, we can do precisely what you just said, press a button and change them.
Sure.
You know, so, you know, this charade, this farce of these people and their murky, hideous, rotten connections just has to end. The boil has to be lanced.
Yeah, and, you know, it hurts when you have a boil and you're putting pressure on it, but
right.
Boy, does it feel good when it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just exactly what we're going to be going through.
Well, I find it so very interesting that the Bush family apparently has recently purchased land for a ranch in Paraguay or Bolivia or someplace like that. Paraguay. Well, Paraguay is one of the most notorious countries in Latin America as being a haven for these post-war Nazis.
Oh, yes.
So, birds of a feather flock together. If that's the kind of people they want to hang out with, then please, by all means, get on the plane, take your family with you, take all the savings and loan money that you looted back in the savings and loan scandal, and leave.
And the Clintons need to go with them.
And the Clintons need to go with them because they've been up to their eyeballs in all of this activity since Clinton was governor of Arkansas and, just quite literally in bed with the same group of people.
Oh, sure.
And, just go. Just go.
Get out of our country.
Right.
Well, okay. Another issue, and boy, you have my agreement on that.
Well, I didn't mean to get on my political soapbox there, but you pressed that button.
People just, she came here, the Wicked Witch of the East, and the women, the crazy women in this town, Joseph, they just went goo-goo over her.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you want to grab them and smack them and say, wake up.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, we've got this little thing about a NASA intercept, a document. It's the Jehovah NASA intercept.
I'm not familiar with it.
Huh. Okay. There's another memo, too, that involved General Motors and Roosevelt.
Okay. We're getting warm. You're going to have to give me more details, though.
I don't know if I can. There's, Teller was pitching the SDI thing to Reagan. Yeah.
Okay. In I think I know where you're going. In the SS Brotherhood of the Bell.
Yeah.
I reproduce some of this second batch of Magic 12 documents. And again, my method here, folks, is to analyze them in terms of their internal evidence and what that evidence says and what it might imply. I am not concerned with issues of authenticity. I'm merely concerned with testing the plausibility of the internal evidence and its assertions themselves. Now, in the Magic 12 version of the letter that Dr. Edward Teller wrote to President Reagan in 1981, in which he was pitching the idea of SDI. And let me break here for a moment to just kind of refresh people's minds as to who Dr. Edward Teller was. He was the American physicist who fathered, so to speak, our hydrogen bomb. So in other words, he had his hands in a lot of the Black Project's research that went on in this country from the time of the Manhattan Project during World War II all the way up till his death.
Right.
So he's a very important figure. And we do know from the public record that Dr. Teller did write such a letter to President Reagan prior to President Reagan's famous Strategic Defense Initiative speech.
Yeah.
But in the letter that Teller writes that's reproduced in the Magic 12 documents, and again, we don't know if it's the authentic letter or not, but it is interesting to note what Teller actually calls SDI. He calls it the Space Defense Initiative.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you read the letter carefully, Teller is almost reticent to name the Soviet Union as the target of that initiative. He has another thing in mind entirely. And if you know the history of the types of weapons that Teller was planning to put into SDI, X-ray lasers, and so, now, friends, an X-ray laser, you don't need an X-ray laser to zap a Soviet ICBM.
Yeah.
But you can sure do a whole lot of damage on the ground with an X-ray laser. It would be the equivalent, and quite literally, to fire one of these things off with the technologies we had in the 1980s, you literally had to blow up a nuclear bomb. So in other words, you have a nuclear bomb being squeezed into a laser beam that's generating X-rays. So you can imagine the kind of power and sort of effects that you would get on the ground from something like that. It's just a horrendously destructive device. And, you know, the Russians at the time that SDI came out just pitched a hissy fit, if people will recall. And the reason they did is that they said that the defensive aspect of this program was a smoke screen, and what we were really trying to do was put strategic offensive weapons in space to be able to target Russia without having any nuclear fallout afterward. So, you know, and from my point of view, the Russians were right, and they were right to raise a hissy fit. I would too if it was my country being targeted by these things. So, you know, this is the Teller thing, and then the Jehovah document that you're referring to. That's one of the most peculiar documents that I examine in SS Brotherhood, because it first of all appears to give some sort of indication that there is a very, very covert, very quiet cooperation between NASA and the Soviet Union in some sort of space project, developing some sort of space weapon. And I find what it says extremely interesting, because in the memo, it's a very short memo, they refer to trying to get money or permission or something from, quote, the 33 investors, unquote. Now, you know, when I read that, my jaw just hit the floor.
33 is a big occultish.
33 is, of course, a very Masonic sort of allusion, because, of course, 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masonry, you know, in this country is so very prevalent. But the other interesting thing is that the tone of the document and the reference in that phrase makes it sound as if both the Soviet and the American programs, whatever they're doing in this thing, are beholden to some external agency. So, you know, I was just literally floored, and I got to digging around, and it so happened that President Roosevelt's financial czar, the man that kind of coordinated all of our country's secret research during World War II, his name was Dr. Vannevar Bush. Well, he turned out to be a Mason. So, you know, everything just seems to be suffused at some very deep level with all of these secret society connections. You have Masons in NASA. You have secret society connections behind the Nazi Party, and on and on and on it goes.
Well, the ideology has never died.
Right.
That's for sure.
Right.
And, you know, we're facing, there's got to be a gigantic house cleaning. Politics needs a big enema. I'm serious.
Yeah, there does.
Wow.
There does seem to be some blockage somewhere.
Yeah.
So.
And it's been blocked so long it stinks.
Too much cheese.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Well, give out the information,
sure,
please, Joseph, how people can get a hold of your material.
Sure. The books are all available from the publisher directly, or from Barnes & Noble or your local Borders. They can special order these if they don't have them in stock. I would ask that you not use certain large internet book selling companies and keep the jobs in this country.
Amen.
And if your local Barnes and Noble or Borders doesn't have the books, then they can be ordered directly from the publisher, and the publisher is Adventures Unlimited Press. It's 1-800-718-4514, or they can go online at www.adventuresunlimitedpress. That's all one word, and it's all lowercase. adventuresunlimitedpress.com. And there is, on orders of 3 or more books, there's a 10% discount. All of the books are $16.95 each, with the exception of the Cosmic War, the newest one, which is $18.95.
Yeah, these, I'm telling you, these are, it's just classic. The effort, the research that you've put into these, oh my goodness. They'd be worth 10 times the price.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Well, no, it's very true. You are a real jewel. I put you right up there with a national treasure.
Well, thank you.
For uncovering and connecting all these dots that you've connected, Joseph. It's a real blessing to us out here.
Well, I hope so.
You know, it truly is. So, everybody, you can also call Adventures Unlimited Press. They have a 24-hour credit card order line. It is 815-253-6390. That's 815-253-6390. And on Joseph's page here at the Byte Show, where his audio files are archived, there the phone number, just scroll down, you'll see it there. The phone number is right there. If in the middle of the night you've just got to read one of these books or all of them, you can call him up anytime. So, and if you do, say hi to Jerry over there for us here at the Byte Show. He's a real jewel. This tonight ends part 5 of the Cosmic War. And Joseph and I are going to talk about the possibility of a part 6. And if you would like to email Joseph, you can do so. His email address is right there on his page at the Byte Show. Go to the library, look for Joseph P. Farrell's name, click on it, and his page opens up. His email address is vardes3@aol.com. That's V as in Victor, A-R-D as in David, A-S, and then put the number 3 at AOL.com. The website is GizaDeathStar.com. And just God bless you, Joseph.
Well, thank you, and you too, GeorgeAnn. I've enjoyed being on your show.
Well, this won't be the last, I'm sure. So this is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Joseph Farrell signing off tonight, and God bless all of you out there with ears to hear. Get these books. You'll be very glad you did. Good night, everybody.
The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.